The mansion in Newport still stands today on Bellevue Avenue, though locals refuse to speak its name aloud. Behind its manicured gardens and pristine marble facade lies a truth so disturbing that 3 generations of Rhode Island families have conspired to bury it. Within those walls, between 1861 and 1863, 7 men died mysteriously. All were connected to the same woman, all bore the same symptoms: violent convulsions, blackened fingernails, and the unmistakable bitter almond scent of arsenic poisoning. What makes this case truly horrifying isn't just the methodical nature of these murders, but the revelation that emerged decades later from a sealed courthouse basement. Her victim's own family members aided the killer, including the very people she was poisoning. Before we continue with the story of Margaret Aldridge and the Newport poisoning ring, make sure to hit that notification bell and subscribe to our channel, because stories like this, hidden from history books and buried by wealthy families, are exactly what we uncover here. And please let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We've received messages from viewers who've actually visited these historical locations, and your local insights always add incredible depth to our investigations. Only in 1924 did the truth about what happened in that mansion begin to surface, when renovation workers discovered a hidden compartment behind the library walls containing documents that would rewrite everything historians thought they knew about one of Newport's most respected families. In the spring of 1861, Newport, Rhode Island was a city caught between 2 worlds. While the industrial North braced for war with the Confederate South, Newport's elite lived in unprecedented luxury. This coastal town had been transformed into America's playground for the wealthy by massive fortunes built on textile mills, shipping routes, and international trade. Like monuments to American capitalism, the famous summer cottages, mansions that rivaled European palaces, lined Bellevue Avenue. Among these architectural marvels stood Ravenscraft Manor, the 40-room estate of the Aldridge family. Built in 1847 with Italian marble, French crystal, and mahogany imported from the Caribbean, it represented everything the American aristocracy aspired to become. A stunning view of the Atlantic Ocean was commanded by the house, its windows reflecting the morning sun like golden eyes watching over the coastline. At 47, Margaret Aldridge was considered one of Newport's most formidable matriarchs. Widowed 3 years earlier when her husband, Edmund, perished in what was reported as a tragic riding accident, she had assumed control of the vast Aldridge fortune with remarkable efficiency. Even the most skeptical men of Newport society were impressed by her sharp intelligence and business acumen, who grudgingly admitted that Edmund's death had revealed his wife to be far more capable than anyone had imagined. A woman of striking presence rather than conventional beauty was how those who knew Margaret described her. Tall and slender, with steel-grey eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they surveyed, she possessed an almost hypnotic ability to command attention in any room. Always perfectly arranged in the latest fashion was her dark hair, now touched with premature silver. Expensively but conservatively she dressed, favoring deep blues and blacks that emphasized her pale complexion and gave her an air of perpetual mourning that men seemed to find both mysterious and appealing. The future Margaret was determined to secure was represented by her daughters. Eleanora, 23, was everything a young lady of good breeding should be: beautiful, accomplished, and blessed with a gentle disposition that made her popular among Newport's eligible bachelors. A more spirited nature and sharp wit was possessed by her younger sister, Catherine, 21, that occasionally worried her mother, who preferred obedient daughters to independent thinkers. Substantial, but not unlimited, was the Aldridge fortune. Edmund had made several poor investments before his death, and the approaching war threatened to disrupt the shipping routes that provided much of the family's income. Margaret understood that her daughters' marriages would determine not just their futures, but the survival of the family's position in society. The gradual decline of everything the Aldridges had built could mean a poor choice of husband. It was against this backdrop of financial uncertainty and social pressure that Eleanor announced her engagement to Charles Whitfield, a handsome 26-year-old from a respected Boston family. Exactly what the Aldridges needed was possessed by Charles: youth, charm, connections to northern textile money, and most importantly, a substantial inheritance that would become available upon his marriage. He was tall and well-built with dark hair and the kind of easy confidence that came from a lifetime of privilege. His education at Harvard had prepared him for a career in law, and his family's political connections suggested a bright future in Boston society. Celebrated as a perfect match by Newport's social elite was the engagement, announced in February 1861. Clearly smitten with Eleanor was Charles, writing her long letters filled with poetry and declarations of eternal devotion. Though more reserved in her affections, Eleanor seemed genuinely happy with the arrangement. Allowing time for the elaborate preparation such a union required, the wedding was planned for June. With an intensity that surprised even her closest friends, Margaret threw herself into the wedding preparations. Every detail from the selection of Eleanor's dress fabric to the arrangement of flowers in the cathedral was personally overseen by her. She insisted on hosting Charles at Ravenscraft Manor for extended visits, claiming that she wanted to know her future son-in-law as well as possible. More frequent became these visits as the wedding approached, with Charles often staying for days at a time. What no one in Newport society understood was that Margaret's attentiveness to Charles stemmed from something far more sinister than maternal concern. From the moment she met him, she had recognized in Charles something that excited her in a way she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't love. Such vulnerability was something Margaret Aldridge was incapable of. It was the thrill of the hunt, the recognition of a worthy challenge, and most importantly, the identification of an opportunity that could solve all her financial problems permanently. On a warm evening in April 1861 came the first sign that something was amiss. For nearly a week, Charles had been staying at Ravenscraft Manor, ostensibly to discuss wedding arrangements and review legal documents related to the merger of their family estates. Into its usual evening routine had settled the household, Eleanor practicing piano in the music room, Catherine reading in the library, and the servants cleaning up after dinner. Alone on the terrace overlooking the ocean, Margaret found Charles, smoking a cigarette and watching the waves crash against the rocks below. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in a silver light that made the scene appear almost theatrical. Slowly she approached him, carrying 2 glasses of brandy and wearing a silk evening gown that accentuated her still impressive figure. "Surely not by thoughts of marriage to my daughter," she said, offering him one of the glasses. "You seem troubled, Charles." Gratefully Charles accepted the brandy, though he noticed that Margaret's proximity made him inexplicably nervous. There was something in her manner, a subtle shift in how she looked at him, how she stood just close enough that her perfume filled his senses that felt inappropriate for a future mother-in-law. "Not troubled exactly," Charles replied, taking a sip of the exceptional brandy. "Just thinking about the future, the war, the changes coming to our world. Sometimes I wonder if we're all living in a kind of dream that's about to end very abruptly." Closer moved Margaret, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body. "Dreams can be dangerous things," she said softly. "They make us forget what's real, what's important. Sometimes the most valuable things in life are right in front of us, but we're too distracted by fantasies to see them." For nearly an hour the conversation continued, with Margaret skillfully guiding Charles through topics that revealed his deepest anxieties and desires. She learned about his financial concerns, his doubts about his legal career, his fear that he might not be worthy of Eleanor's love. With each revelation, she positioned herself as someone who understood him better than anyone else ever had. What Charles didn't know was that Margaret had been studying him for weeks, learning his habits, his weaknesses, his schedule. His correspondence with Eleanor she had read, searching for insights into his character. Discreet inquiries about his family's finances she had made, discovering that his inheritance was even larger than she had hoped. Most importantly, she'd been adding small amounts of a mild sedative to his evening brandy. Nothing dangerous, just enough to make him more susceptible to suggestion and less likely to maintain appropriate boundaries. That night, as they stood together on the terrace, Margaret made her first move. Subtle it was, a hand placed on his arm to emphasize a point, a laugh that lingered just a moment too long, a compliment about his intelligence that came with a look that spoke of deeper appreciation. Already confused by the unusual intimacy of their conversation and the effects of the drugged brandy, Charles found himself responding despite his better judgment. "You're not at all what I expected," he admitted, his voice slightly slurred. "When Eleanor described her mother, I pictured someone different, more conventional." "And what do you think of me now?" Margaret asked, her steel-grey eyes fixed on his with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. Appropriate words Charles struggled to find, but the brandy and Margaret's proximity made clear thinking impossible. "I think," he said slowly, "that Eleanor is very fortunate to have learned grace and intelligence from such a remarkable woman." Exactly the opening Margaret had been waiting for, was it? She stepped closer, close enough that her breath warmed his neck as she whispered, "Some lessons can only be learned through experience, Charles. Some forms of education require a more personal approach." That night the seduction didn't happen. Far too clever to rush such a delicate operation was Margaret. Instead, she planted seeds of desire and confusion that would grow over the following days. Just as Charles seemed ready to cross a line he couldn't uncross, she withdrew, leaving him frustrated and guilty, unsure of what had almost happened or why he felt such a strong pull toward his fiancée's mother. From the terrace, Eleanor, practicing piano in the music room, heard only the murmur of voices and assumed her mother and Charles were discussing wedding details. When he came back inside, Catherine, reading in the library, noticed that Charles seemed agitated but attributed it to pre-wedding nerves. Well trained to be invisible and deaf to their employer's private conversations, the servants observed nothing that wouldn't be expected in a house preparing for a society wedding. But something that troubled her deeply was noticed by Margaret's lady's maid, Sarah Connolly, a sharp-eyed Irish woman who had served the family for 15 years. As she helped Margaret prepare for bed that night, she saw her mistress examining her reflection in the mirror with a satisfaction that seemed inappropriate for a woman whose daughter was about to marry. Carefully Sarah ventured, "You seem pleased with the evening." Smiled Margaret, but it wasn't the warm expression of a happy mother. It was the cold, calculating smile of a predator who had successfully identified her prey. "Yes, Sarah," she replied, brushing her hair with slow, deliberate strokes. "I believe everything is proceeding exactly as it should." The next morning brought unsettling news that would cast the first shadow of suspicion over Margaret's carefully constructed world. With a deeply troubled expression arrived Dr. William Hensley, the family physician who had attended Edmund Aldridge during his final illness 3 years earlier, at Ravenscraft Manor. In the privacy of her study, he explained to Margaret that he had come because of disturbing rumors circulating among Newport's medical community. "There have been questions, Margaret," Dr. Hensley said, accepting the tea she offered with obvious reluctance. "Questions about Edmund's death that I frankly hoped would never arise." Perfectly composed remained Margaret's expression, though her hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she poured her own tea. What sort of questions could there possibly be about a riding accident? A man of 62, was Drive Hensley with grey hair and tired eyes that had seen too much suffering over the decades. He had attended the births of Margaret's daughters, treated the family through various illnesses, and considered himself a friend as well as a physician, which made what he had to say even more difficult. Edmund's symptoms before his death, he continued reluctantly. The convulsions, the digestive distress, the way his fingernails darkened in those final days. At the time, I attributed everything to internal injuries from the fall. But other physicians have suggested that the progression was more consistent with poisoning than trauma. With perfect steadiness Margaret sat down her teacup. "Dr. Hensley, surely you're not suggesting that my husband was murdered? By whom and why?" "I'm not suggesting anything," he replied quickly. "I'm simply telling you that questions are being asked, questions that could become very uncomfortable if they reach the wrong ears." What Dr. Hensley didn't tell Margaret was that the questions had originated from an unexpected source, Charles Whitfield himself. During a dinner party the previous week at the Vanderbilt mansion, Charles had mentioned Edmund's death to Dr. James Morrison, a physician from Boston who specialized in cases of suspected poisoning. Dr. Morrison's casual questions about the symptoms had revealed details that made him deeply suspicious, and he had shared those suspicions with colleagues in Newport's medical community. From suspicion hadn't arisen Charles's interest in Edmund's death, but from his legal training. He had been reviewing the Aldridge family's financial documents in preparation for the marriage contracts and had noticed several irregularities in the timing of Edmund's will changes and insurance policies. In the months before his death, Edmund had made substantial modifications to his estate planning. Changes that heavily favored Margaret and gave her unprecedented control over the family finances. For his concern Margaret thanked Dr. Hensley and assured him that she welcomed any investigation that might put such terrible rumors to rest. But after he left, she sat alone in her study for nearly an hour, staring out the window at the Atlantic Ocean and calculating her options. She had always known this moment might come, had always prepared for the possibility that Edmund's death would eventually attract unwanted attention. What she hadn't expected was that the threat would come from Charles himself. That evening, Margaret made a decision that would transform her from a woman who had killed once out of desperation into something far more dangerous. She would not merely survive the investigation into Edmund's death, she would use it to eliminate every threat to her security permanently. More dangerous than she had initially realized had Charles's suspicious inquiries revealed him to be, but they had also shown her exactly how to turn that danger to her advantage. Breathtaking in its audacity and horrifying in its implications was the plan that began forming in Margaret's mind. She would seduce Charles, not just to steal him from Eleanor, but to make him complicit in a scheme that would secure the Aldridge fortune forever. His legal expertise she would use to help her create the perfect series of accidents that would eliminate everyone who posed a threat to her secret, including her own daughters, if necessary. But first, she needed to ensure Charles's complete cooperation, and she knew exactly how to achieve it. Late that night, as the household slept, Margaret made her way to Charles's guest room. More heavily than usual she had drugged his evening brandy, ensuring he would be in a state of confused arousal when she arrived. Over the following hours, what happened in that room would bind Charles to her in ways that made backing away impossible. Charles's own handwritten confession was included in the documents discovered in 1924, sealed in an envelope marked to be opened only upon my death. So shocking was what that confession revealed about his first night with Margaret Aldridge that the authorities considered burning it rather than preserving it as evidence. If you're finding this story as disturbing as we are, hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. These are the kinds of buried truths that powerful families spend fortunes to keep hidden. Meanwhile, Eleanor slept peacefully in her room just down the hall, completely unaware that her engagement had just become something far more sinister than a simple betrayal. She didn't know that her fiancé was no longer just unfaithful, he was now an accessory to murder, bound to her mother by secrets that would eventually destroy them all. Subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew him well was the transformation in Charles over the following days. Eleanor noticed that he seemed distracted during their conversations, often staring off into space with an expression she couldn't quite read. When she asked if something was troubling him, he assured her that everything was perfect, but his smile seemed forced and his eyes held a strange new intensity. Catherine, whose sharp wit made her more observant than her gentle sister, noticed that Charles had begun seeking out private conversations with their mother at every opportunity. She found them together in the library one afternoon, sitting closer than seemed appropriate, their voices dropping to whispers whenever she entered the room. When she mentioned this to Eleanor, her sister dismissed it as natural. Of course, Charles wants to establish a good relationship with his future mother-in-law. The true nature of those private conversations was what Catherine and Eleanor couldn't have imagined. Still reeling from his night with Margaret and the shocking revelation she had shared with him, Charles was being systematically drawn into a conspiracy that would make him complicit in crimes he had never dreamed possible. Everything had Margaret revealed to him: Edmund's murder, the forged documents, the carefully planned accident that had made her a wealthy widow. But she had presented it all as a desperate act of self-defense against an abusive husband who had threatened to destroy her and her daughters financially. She claimed that Edmund had been planning to divorce her and leave her penniless, forcing her to choose between her family's survival and her conscience. "I never wanted to become this person," she told Charles during one of their secret meetings, allowing tears to flow down her cheeks with practiced precision. "But when faced with the choice between my daughter's future and my own soul, what mother wouldn't sacrifice everything to protect her children?" Already compromised by his physical relationship with Margaret and struggling with guilt over his betrayal of Eleanor, Charles found himself drawn deeper into her web of justifications and half-truths. A victim forced into terrible choices by circumstances beyond her control was how Margaret's version of events painted her. So skilled at mixing truth with manipulation was she that Charles began to believe he was helping to protect Eleanor and Catherine rather than endangering them. Harmless enough seemed the first task Margaret gave Charles, using his legal expertise to review the family's estate planning documents and identify potential vulnerabilities that could threaten their security. With genuine enthusiasm, Charles threw himself into this work, grateful to find a way to contribute to the family's welfare that didn't require him to examine his own moral compromises too closely. Should have terrified Charles was what he discovered in those documents. Unmistakable once he knew what to look for was the pattern. A series of careful changes to wills, insurance policies, and property deeds that maximized Margaret's benefit while minimizing outside scrutiny had preceded Edmund's death. Even more disturbing, he found evidence of similar patterns surrounding the deaths of two other men connected to the Aldridge family: Margaret's first husband, who had died in a boating accident before Charles was born, and Eleanor's former fiancé, Thomas Richardson, who had died in a carriage accident just months before Charles began courting Eleanor. Particularly suspicious was Thomas Richardson's death because Charles had known him slightly at Harvard. Healthy, athletic, and an experienced horseman, had Thomas been extremely unlikely to lose control of his carriage on a familiar road in good weather. Little sense made the circumstances of the accident: a sudden panic in his horses on a calm evening, leading to a crash that broke his neck, to anyone who knew Thomas's skill with horses. With his discoveries, Charles confronted Margaret, expecting her to be shocked by the implications. Instead, she calmly confirmed his worst suspicions. Indeed, had Thomas discovered something about Edmund's death that made him dangerous, and Margaret had been forced to act to protect herself and her daughters. Genuine accidents that unfortunately created a pattern that could be misinterpreted by suspicious minds were what she claimed the other deaths had been. "You see why I need your help," Margaret told him, her hand resting on his arm with intimate familiarity. "Essential to ensure that no more accidents are necessary is someone with your intelligence and legal training. With your help, we can secure the family's future without anyone else getting hurt." Horrified was Charles to realize that part of him found Margaret's calm pragmatism about murder almost admirable. A madwoman or a sadist she wasn't; she was a cold-blooded strategist who eliminated threats to her family with the same methodical planning that a general might use to win a war. In his compromised state, he began to rationalize her actions as necessary evils, even as his conscience screamed that he was becoming complicit in unspeakable crimes. When she revealed the full scope of her current plan came the final step in Margaret's seduction of Charles. With maternal concern, Margaret explained that Eleanor had become suspicious about her engagement and was asking uncomfortable questions about Thomas Richardson's death. Worse, she had been corresponding with relatives in Boston who might be able to piece together the truth about the family's history of convenient deaths. "I love my daughter," Margaret said with what seemed like genuine anguish, "but she's young and naive about how dangerous the truth can be. If she continues investigating, she'll not only destroy herself, but bring scandal down on all of us, including you, Charles. Your association with this family would ruin your career and your reputation permanently." Elegantly simple and absolutely monstrous was Margaret's solution. Before she could expose the family's secrets, would Eleanor have to suffer a tragic accident? Heartbreaking it would be, but it was the only way to protect everyone else, including Catherine, who was still young enough to build a new life away from Newport's gossip and suspicion. Should have driven Charles to flee Ravenscraft Manor immediately and report everything to the authorities was his horror at this suggestion. Instead, he found himself asking practical questions about timing and methods as if he were reviewing a legal contract rather than planning his fiancée's murder. Complete was the transformation. Margaret Aldridge's willing accomplice in a scheme that would kill the woman he had promised to cherish and protect had Charles Whitfield, who had arrived in Newport as an honorable young man planning to marry for love, become. On a rainy morning in early May came Eleanor's first concrete suspicion, when she found Charles and her mother examining a bottle of wine in the cellar beneath Ravenscraft Manor. Close together they were standing, speaking in urgent whispers, and when they noticed her approach, both fell silent with the guilty expressions of conspirators caught in the act. "We were just selecting wine for tonight's dinner," Margaret explained smoothly, though Eleanor noticed that neither of them was holding the bottle anymore. "Quite an appreciation for our cellar has Charles developed," smiled Eleanor and accepted the explanation, but something about the scene troubled her. Covered in dust was the bottle they had been examining, clearly one of the older vintages that Margaret usually reserved for special occasions. More puzzling, Eleanor was certain she had seen Charles slip something small into his jacket pocket just before she appeared. Closer attention at dinner that evening did Eleanor pay to the interactions between her mother and fiancé. She noticed the way Margaret's fingers lingered when passing Charles the salt, how their eyes met with understanding when discussing seemingly innocent topics, how Charles seemed to hang on Margaret's every word with an intensity that went far beyond polite interest. Immediate and telling was the reaction from both Margaret and Charles when Eleanor mentioned that she had received a letter from Thomas Richardson's sister in Boston asking questions about the circumstances of his death. Halfway to her mouth paused Margaret's fork, and Charles actually dropped his wine glass, sending red wine spreading across the white tablecloth like spilled blood. "How clumsy of me," Charles said, his voice strained as he reached for his napkin. "I can't imagine why Miss Richardson would be asking such questions after all this time." "Grief affects people differently," Margaret replied carefully, signaling for a servant to clean up the spill. "Some people can't accept that accidents are simply accidents. They need someone to blame." Found herself studying her mother's face as she spoke did Eleanor. Perfectly controlled was Margaret's expression, but there was something cold in her eyes that Eleanor had never noticed before, a calculating quality that made her feel suddenly unsafe in her own home. Later that night, Eleanor made a decision that would put her in mortal danger. She decided to search Thomas Richardson's personal effects, which had been stored in the mansion's attic after his death. If there was something suspicious about his accident, she reasoned, there might be evidence among his belongings that would explain why his sister was still asking questions. Made her blood run cold was what Eleanor found in Thomas's trunk. A leather portfolio containing detailed notes about Edmund Aldridge's death, including medical observations that cast serious doubt on the official story of a riding accident, was hidden beneath his clothing. Investigating Margaret had Thomas been documenting inconsistencies in her account of Edmund's final illness and collecting testimony from servants who had witnessed strange behavior during that period. Even more disturbing was a letter Thomas had written but never sent, addressed to the Newport police chief. In it, he laid out his suspicions about Margaret systematically, citing specific evidence and requesting a formal investigation. Just 3 days before his own death was the letter dated. In the dusty attic, surrounded by Thomas's belongings, sat Eleanor, and realized that the man she had almost married had died because he had discovered the truth about her father's murder. Worse, she now understood that her current engagement was somehow connected to the same deadly pattern. Charles's strange behavior, his secretive conversations with Margaret, the way both of them had reacted to news of Thomas's sister's inquiries, it all pointed to a conspiracy that put Eleanor herself in terrible danger. Ice through Eleanor's veins sent the sound of footsteps on the attic stairs. Quickly she hid Thomas's portfolio under her skirt and pretended to be examining his clothing with nostalgic sadness. But so loudly was her heart pounding she was certain whoever was coming could hear it. At the top of the stairs appeared Margaret, carrying a lamp and wearing a concerned expression that no longer seemed genuine to Eleanor's newly suspicious eyes. "My dear, what are you doing up here so late?" Margaret asked, her voice gentle, but her eyes sharp as she surveyed the scattered contents of Thomas's trunk. "Surely it's not healthy to dwell on such sad memories." "I was just remembering," Eleanor replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Miss Richardson's letter made me think of him. I thought perhaps there might be something among his things that would comfort her." Closer moved Margaret, and Eleanor caught a whiff of her perfume mixed with something else, a faint, bitter scent that seemed oddly familiar but which she couldn't quite identify. "That's very thoughtful of you," Margaret said. "But I'm afraid stirring up old grief might do more harm than good. Some wounds heal better when they're left undisturbed." Made Eleanor's skin crawl did the way Margaret emphasized the word undisturbed. A clear warning in her mother's tone was there, a suggestion that continuing to investigate Thomas's death would be unwise. With growing horror realized Eleanor that she was no longer looking at her mother, but at a stranger, a dangerous stranger who had somehow replaced the woman who had raised her. "Of course, Mother," Eleanor said, forcing herself to smile. "You're absolutely right. I should focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past." Smiled back Margaret, but calculation behind the expression could Eleanor see. "Exactly, my dear. Your wedding is only weeks away. That should be your only concern now." As Margaret turned to leave, a discovery that confirmed her worst fears did Eleanor make. From her mother's pocket had fallen a small glass vial, rolling across the attic floor to stop near Eleanor's feet. A white powder was contained in the vial, and it was labeled in Margaret's handwriting, "For headaches, use sparingly." Immediately did Eleanor recognize the vial. For years had Margaret been carrying identical bottles, claiming they contained medicine for her frequent headaches. But realized Eleanor now that the bitter scent she had detected on her mother was the same smell that had been present in the house during her father's final illness and during the weeks before Thomas Richardson's death. Headache medicine wasn't the white powder, it was poison. And with crystalline clarity understood Eleanor that she was living in a house with a woman who had murdered at least 2 men and was planning to kill again. The question was, who would be Margaret's next victim? Told her that she herself was in immediate danger did Eleanor's instincts, but logic suggested that Charles, as Margaret's co-conspirator, would be safe. What Eleanor didn't know was that Margaret had already decided that Charles knew too much to be allowed to survive much longer, and that both of them were now living on borrowed time. Arsenic was the poison Margaret used, readily available in 1861 as a rat poison and easily disguised in food or drink. Limited was medical knowledge of arsenic poisoning, making it the perfect murder weapon for someone clever enough to use it sparingly over time. If this revelation is sending chills down your spine, you're not alone. Hit that like button if you're as horrified as we are by Margaret's calculated cruelty. And make sure you're subscribed because we're about to reveal how Eleanor's discovery led to a confrontation that would determine whether she lived to see another day. What Eleanor couldn't have known as she hid that vial and tried to appear normal was that Margaret had already begun adding small amounts of arsenic to both Eleanor's and Charles's food, testing to see how much each could tolerate before showing symptoms. Stress from wedding preparations weren't the headaches Eleanor had been experiencing for the past week, they were the first signs of arsenic poisoning. In a state of controlled terror did Eleanor spend the next 3 days, trying to act normally while secretly preparing to save her own life. She began avoiding meals whenever possible, claiming nervous excitement about the wedding was affecting her appetite. She started carrying Thomas Richardson's evidence portfolio with her at all times, hidden beneath her clothing, knowing it might be her only proof of Margaret's crimes if she needed to seek help. On the night of May 15, 1861, exactly 1 month before Eleanor's scheduled wedding, came the confrontation. Again she had discovered Margaret and Charles in the wine cellar, but this time she had hidden on the stairs and listened to their entire conversation. What she heard confirmed her worst fears and revealed the full scope of their murderous conspiracy. "The dosage needs to be increased," Margaret was saying, her voice calm and businesslike. "Resistance is showing, Eleanor, and we can't afford to let this drag on much longer. The wedding is in 4 weeks and she needs to be incapacitated before then." Strained with guilt and fear was Charles's voice. "Margaret, I can't. Watching her suffer like this is destroying me. There has to be another way." "There is no other way," Margaret replied coldly. "Too much has seen Eleanor, knows too much. If you hadn't been so careless with those documents, we wouldn't be in this position. And rather touching is your sudden attack of conscience, but far too late for second thoughts, is it?" "What about Catherine?" Charles asked. "She's been asking questions, too." Chilling in its casual cruelty was Margaret's laugh. "Heartbroken by her sister's tragic illness will Catherine be, of course. So heartbroken that she'll need to travel abroad to recover. I'm thinking somewhere remote, perhaps a sanatorium in the mountains where the air is thin and accidents are common." Against the stone wall of the staircase pressed Eleanor herself, struggling not to gasp aloud at the implications of her mother's words. Not just planning to kill her was Margaret, she was planning to murder Catherine as well, eliminating both daughters to secure complete control of the family fortune. Barely a whisper was Charles's voice. "After Eleanor and Catherine are gone, what happens to us?" Closer to Charles moved Margaret, and Eleanor could hear the rustle of silk as her mother's dress brushed against him. "Free we'll be, Charles. Free to be together, free to enjoy the life we've created. Think of it, all of Newport society believing we found comfort in each other after losing poor Eleanor. It's almost romantic." What Margaret didn't tell Charles was that she had already decided he would be her next victim after Catherine's death. His purpose had Charles served by providing legal expertise and helping with the murders, but he was ultimately too weak and guilt-ridden to be trusted long-term. A few months after their grief-stricken marriage, Charles would suffer a tragic accident, leaving Margaret as the sole heir to both the Aldridge and Whitfield fortunes. Enough had Eleanor heard. She crept back upstairs, her mind racing with plans for escape. She needed to get away from Ravenscraft Manor immediately, but she also needed to ensure that Margaret's crimes were exposed and that Catherine was warned about the danger she faced. Crucial was the portfolio of evidence, but realized Eleanor it wouldn't be enough on its own. She needed witnesses, official support, and most importantly, she needed to survive long enough to tell her story. Into action galvanized Eleanor the sound of footsteps coming up from the cellar. She hurried to her room and quickly packed a small bag with essential items, including Thomas Richardson's evidence portfolio. A brief note to Catherine she wrote, warning her sister about Margaret's plans and begging her to flee the house immediately. Then she waited by her window, watching for an opportunity to escape without being seen. Near midnight came the opportunity, when both Margaret and Charles retired to their respective rooms. Through the servants' entrance slipped Eleanor and made her way across the grounds toward the stable, intending to take a horse and ride to Newport's town centre, where she could seek help from the authorities. Almost reached the stable had she when a voice called out from behind her. "Going somewhere, my dear?" Turned Eleanor to see Margaret standing in the shadow of the mansion, still wearing her evening gown but now carrying something that glinted in the moonlight. With horror realized Eleanor as her eyes adjusted that her mother was holding a revolver. "Just some fresh air, I couldn't sleep," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I thought it might help." Closer stepped Margaret, the gun never wavering from its target. "With a traveling bag? How thoughtful of you to pack for your midnight stroll." Her voice was still controlled, but there was a dangerous edge that Eleanor had never heard before. "Disappointed in you I am, Eleanor. I had hoped we could handle this quietly without unpleasantness, but it seems you've inherited your father's stubborn streak." Useless would be running, realized Eleanor. Too close was Margaret, and little cover offered the grounds between the stable and the gates. Her only chance was to keep talking and hope that someone might hear or that Margaret might make a mistake. "Everything I know," Eleanor said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "Thomas's investigation, father's murder, your plans for Catherine and Charles. You can't kill all of us and expect no one to notice." Cold and satisfied was Margaret's smile. "Can't I? Watch me." She raised the revolver, her finger tightening on the trigger. Across the estate grounds like thunder echoed the gunshot that followed, shattering the peaceful night and alerting everyone within miles that something terrible had happened at Ravenscraft Manor. But didn't find Eleanor the bullet. Instead, it went wide as Margaret stumbled backward, crying out in pain and surprise. From behind had struck her mother Catherine with a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, having followed Eleanor outside after finding the warning note. Intended to kill hadn't been the blow, but powerful enough to send Margaret sprawling across the gravel pathway it was, the revolver spinning away into the darkness. "Eleanor, run!" shouted Catherine. But already moving was her sister, racing toward the stable with Catherine close behind. Behind them could they hear Margaret, screaming with rage and pain, her voice carrying across the grounds like the cry of a wounded animal. "Ungrateful little bitches," shrieked Margaret, struggling to her feet despite the blood flowing from the gash on her head. "Everything I gave you. From poverty and disgrace I protected you. This is how you repay me." The stable reached the sisters and quickly saddled 2 horses, their hands shaking with adrenaline and terror. Behind them could they see lights appearing in the mansion's windows as servants awakened to investigate the gunshot. But a more terrifying sight they also saw, Charles emerging from the house, carrying a lantern and what appeared to be another weapon. "For Charles she's calling," gasped Catherine as they mounted their horses. "Both going to come after us they are." One last time looked back Eleanor at the mansion, seeing Margaret silhouetted against the light from the open front door, blood streaming down her face, but very much alive and furious. "Then we'd better make sure we reach town before they can organize a pursuit," she said. Forward spurred their horses the sisters, galloping down the long drive toward the gates of Ravenscraft Manor. Behind them could they hear shouting and the sound of other horses being prepared, but a crucial head start they had. At full gallop would take 20 minutes the ride to Newport's town centre. If they could maintain their lead, they might reach safety before Margaret and Charles could catch them. As they rode through the moonlit countryside, from her bag pulled Eleanor Thomas Richardson's evidence portfolio and handed it to Catherine. "Make sure this reaches the authorities if something happens to me," she shouted over the thunder of hoofbeats. "Proof of everything it contains, father's murder, Thomas's investigation, all of it." Took the portfolio Catherine, her face grim with determination. "Nothing is going to happen to either of us," she replied. "Survive this we're going to, and hang for what she's done we're going to see Margaret." But even as she spoke those brave words, in the distance could Catherine see riders behind them, gaining ground rapidly. Faster than the sisters had hoped had Margaret and Charles organized their pursuit, and slowly closing the gap were their fresher horses. At the Newport town square ended the chase, where half the town awakened by Eleanor and Catherine's desperate arrival at full gallop, screaming for help, and brought the night constable running from his post. So wild was the sisters' story, so impossible to believe, that under normal circumstances they might have been dismissed as hysterical young women suffering from pre-wedding nerves. But Thomas Richardson's evidence portfolio, combined with the sisters' detailed knowledge of Margaret's crimes and the dramatic arrival of Margaret and Charles in pursuit, convinced the authorities to take immediate action. From his bed summoned Dr. Hensley to examine the evidence, confirmed that the medical observations in Thomas's notes were consistent with arsenic poisoning, and that he had harbored similar suspicions about Edmund Aldridge's death. At dawn on May 16, 1861, came Margaret's arrest, as she sat in Ravenscraft Manor's drawing room, calmly sipping tea and acting as if nothing unusual had happened. When confronted with the evidence against her, with such convincing dignity maintained she her innocence that some observers began to doubt the charges. Only when arsenic was discovered hidden throughout the house, in her bedroom, the kitchen, even sewn into the lining of her favorite coat, did her facade finally crack. More complex was Charles's fate. In a jail cell while awaiting trial his confession revealed the full extent of his complicity, but also painted him as a victim of Margaret's manipulation. In horrifying detail described the document discovered decades later how Margaret had seduced him, compromised him, and gradually transformed him from an honorable young man into an accessory to murder. "I believed I was protecting Eleanor," Charles wrote in his confession. "Convince me, Margaret, that silence was the only way to keep Eleanor and Catherine safe, that exposure would destroy them as surely as the truth would destroy me. By the time I understood that Margaret intended to kill Eleanor regardless, so deep in her web of lies and crimes was I that escape seemed impossible. Tell myself I would have found the courage to resist eventually I do, but in my darkest moments, know I that cowardice and desire made me her willing accomplice." One of the most sensational cases in Rhode Island's legal history became the trial of Margaret Aldridge. By revelations about the respectable widow who had systematically murdered her way to wealth and security was rocked Newport's elite society. Every detail from Margaret's cold demeanor in the courtroom to the dramatic testimony of her own daughters was covered by newspapers across New England. Guilt never admitted Margaret, maintaining until the end that she was the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by ungrateful children and ambitious prosecutors seeking to make their reputations. She claimed that a genuine accident had Edmund's death been, that an unfortunate carriage mishap had Thomas Richardson died in, and that out of greed for their inheritance had her daughters fabricated evidence. But overwhelming was the physical evidence. In hair samples taken from Edmund's exhumed body was found arsenic. When examined, Thomas Richardson's body showed clear signs of arsenic poisoning that had been missed during the original investigation. Most damning of all, of Eleanor revealed medical examination significant levels of arsenic in her system, proving that Margaret had indeed been slowly poisoning her own daughter. For his role in the conspiracy received Charles a sentence of 20 years in prison, though only 12 he served before dying of consumption in his cell. Just before his death his final letter to Eleanor begged her forgiveness and expressed his hope that she had found the happiness that his weakness had nearly destroyed. By hanging was sentenced to death Margaret Aldridge, making her one of the few women to receive capital punishment in Rhode Island during that era. On October 13, 1862, was she executed, maintaining her innocence to the end. That she walked to the gallows with perfect composure reported witnesses, dressed in her finest black silk gown and showing no emotion beyond mild irritation at the crowd's behavior. What remained of the Aldridge fortune after legal fees and restitution payments inherited Eleanor and Catherine, but they chose to leave Newport forever, selling Ravenscraft Manor and moving to California, where they could begin new lives away from the scandal. Never marry did Eleanor, dedicating her life to helping other women escape dangerous domestic situations. A doctor married Catherine and had 4 children, but never publicly about the events at Ravenscraft Manor did she speak. For nearly 20 years stood empty the mansion itself before being purchased and demolished. A completely different house on the site built the new owners, a shipping family from Boston, claiming they wanted no connection to the building where so many people had died. That the original house had been cursed held local legend, though far more mundane was the truth. In a place so thoroughly associated with Margaret Aldridge's crimes wanted no one to live. Disturbing questions about how many similar crimes might have gone undetected raises the case of Margaret Aldridge, in an era when women were considered incapable of such calculated violence and when medical knowledge of poisoning was limited. Behind facades of respectability and social standing, how many loving mothers and devoted wives might have been hiding similar secrets? What do you think of this story? Do you believe Margaret's actions were those of a desperate woman driven to extremes? Or simply a cold-blooded killer was she who used societal expectations about women to mask her true nature? Leave your comment below and let us know your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale of hidden murder and family betrayal, make sure to hit that notification bell and subscribe so you never miss our investigations into history's darkest secrets. Share this video with someone who loves true crime and historical mysteries. Told need to be these stories, no matter how disturbing they might be. In the next video we'll see you, where we'll explore another case of buried truth and family secrets that powerful people hoped would never see the light of day. For over 60 years remained buried the truth about Margaret Aldridge and the Newport poisoning ring, known only to the families directly affected and a few legal professionals who kept the record sealed. Only when those 1924 renovations uncovered the hidden documents did historians begin to piece together the full scope of her crimes. Even today, some details remain mysteries. How many men did Margaret actually kill? Were there other victims whose deaths were never connected to her? And most chilling of all, in Victorian America, how many other Margaret Aldridge were there, hiding their murderous natures behind the masks of respectability and maternal devotion? May never be fully answered these questions, but as a stark reminder that evil often wears the most innocent faces serves the case, and that the most dangerous predators are often those we trust most completely.